As Mark stood on his dock, watching HOA board members receive letters banning them from the very lake they once ruled, a floating LED billboard lit up behind him. Let freedom cast. Cheers erupted around him, but behind the curtain of celebration, something darker was brewing. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Mark didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He paid the $500 fine online the same night, sat back in his leather desk chair, and stared out at the darkened lake, black glass under a silver moon. Silence filled the room, save for the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional rustle of night wind brushing the trees. His eyes didn't move. They stayed fixed on the water, not even 3 weeks into his so-called paradise, and already the rot had surfaced. The insult wasn't in the fine. It wasn't even in the rule. It was the way it had been delivered. Condescension disguised as civility. That polished venom in Carol's smile. The casual tyranny in her tone. The HOA had made it clear. This wasn't his lake. Not really. He just happened to live near it. He recalled her exact words. "We reserve the right to decline." A voluntary prison, then. A gated community governed not by reason, but by people who had nothing better to do than micromanage others. Mark reached for the scotch bottle he kept tucked behind the Hemingway first editions on his bookshelf, poured himself a glass. Neat. The amber liquid caught the moonlight and glowed like fire. He hadn't built a multi-million-dollar company by rolling over. Back in tech, Mark had dealt with corporate saboteurs, hostile takeovers, and litigious parasites. But even those sharks wore their teeth openly. This was different. The Ridgewater Board cloaked their power in the polite language of compliance and community. It was tyranny in pastels. He stood and walked to the glass doors overlooking the lake, slid one open. The night air spilled in, cool, wet, carrying the scent of pine and algae. He stepped outside, barefoot on the deck, the wood cool against his soles. This was his. This house. This deck. That lake. The land stretching behind his property was deeded. Private. He'd checked. The HOA's jurisdiction over the water was murky at best, a patchwork of vague clauses and loosely interpreted bylaws. They'd built a cage from bureaucracy, hoping no one would notice the lock was plastic. But Mark noticed. And Mark didn't forget. A fine, they called it. Just money. But to him, it was theft. They had stolen peace. They had spit in his face and called it process. The glass in his hand trembled slightly as anger began to simmer under the surface. He steadied it. Not now. Not yet. The worst thing you could do to people like Carol was lose your temper. They fed on that. What they couldn't handle was cold calculation. He would smile at them, comply, play the part of the docile newcomer. But every interaction, every meeting, every word they spoke from this point forward, he would remember, study, catalog. He'd built algorithms that predicted human behavior with near-perfect accuracy. Now he would apply that to Carol, Tom, and Denise. They wanted war? Fine. But Mark Reynolds didn't fight like most people. He'd bury them in their own rules. Carol's letter arrived on thick, expensive paper, the kind chosen to intimidate. Legal phrasing packed tight as bricks, all caps for emphasis, cease and desist. Accusations of intentional disruption, violation of HOA cooperative intent, and the particularly laughable phrase, emotional distress through targeted exclusion. Mark read it at his kitchen counter while sipping coffee from a mug that said, "World's Most Problematic Neighbor." He didn't bother reading it twice. Instead, he placed the letter beside a certified copy of the lake deed, drew a yellow smiley face in the signature box, took a photo, and emailed it to the board with the subject line, "Smile, Carol." The move wasn't about fishing anymore. This was a chessboard, and Mark had claimed the queen before they realized the game had started. His email auto-response was still set to, "I'll get back to you after I'm done enjoying my lake." What burned Carol, Tom, and Denise wasn't just that he'd outmaneuvered them, It was the style. The invitations to the Freedom Fish Fest had been hand-delivered by a local Girl Scout troop, Mark sponsored, each one dressed in Lake Ranger t-shirts and accompanied by a complimentary tackle box filled with candy and miniature HOA violation slips that read, "No joy allowed, signed Carol." He'd turned their rules into satire, their power into punchlines. But beneath the spectacle, Mark was methodical. He had studied their patterns. Carol held all sway through legal intimidation, but she was fundamentally risk-averse. Her threats were bark, no bite, unless she believed she'd win without resistance. Tom loved gossip and posturing, but had no head for details. Denise? She thrived on petty dominance, but crumbled under public embarrassment. At the Fish Fest, he had seated her in direct view of a dunk tank labeled Neighborhood Narc, where her teenage grandkids had lined up to take turns throwing softballs. Mark never had to raise his voice. The public saw to that. Once residents realized that the board had never actually owned the lake, that their rules had been propped up by assumption and arrogance, discontent turned to outrage. People began digging through their own fines, calling into question years of unjust citations and fees. And Mark, always 10 steps ahead, provided a discreet online archive of HOA meeting minutes, complete with keyword search, highlighting every time Carol or her crew had overstepped. He didn't need revenge to be dramatic. He needed it to be undeniable. The board called an emergency meeting. Mark showed up early, sipping sweet tea on the front row, flanked by neighbors who used to fear HOA retaliation, but now wore campaign buttons. "Make Ridgewater reasonable again." Carol refused to look at him. Tom nervously fumbled with his phone. Denise sat pale and stiff, whispering urgently to herself. This wasn't rebellion. It was a referendum. They had ruled through quiet terror for too long. Now the silence had cracked, and fury poured in through every seam. And Mark? He sat, arms crossed, calm as a storm's eye. He wasn't just going to beat them. He was going to rewrite the rules they'd built their thrones upon. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, clean, inevitable. In the space of a weekend, Ridgewater Lake Estates transformed from a landscape of fear into one of long-suppressed truth. Once fractured neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder at block meetings and over backyard fences, swapping war stories of fines, threats, and humiliations doled out by a regime they had accepted for too long. They weren't just signing a petition, they were reclaiming their dignity. The numbers spoke for themselves. 112 homes, 104 signatures in less than 48 hours. Tom was the first to stumble. An anonymous leak, though no one had to guess the source, revealed a paper trail of home inspections conducted without notice. Violations were issued, then homes were quietly purchased at reduced value by a trust linked to Tom's real estate firm. He had profited off fear, turning neighbor against neighbor. The scandal broke like a thunderclap. His open house signs disappeared overnight, and his business line went suspiciously quiet. Denise, the self-proclaimed decorum enforcer, tried to lie low, but she couldn't resist the lake. On the day of the Fish Fest, she arrived in a tragic disguise. Oversized sunglasses, a floral scarf knotted under her chin, and a baseball cap that read #1 Lake Lover. A teenager live-streamed her attempted entry and unmasking. The clip went viral in the Ridgewater group chat with the caption, "Grinch caught poaching joy." Her public shaming was complete. And then there was Carol. For years, she had operated with the precision of a judge and the immunity of a monarch. When she tried to challenge Mark's event, claiming it constituted unauthorized commercial activity, she expected the threat of litigation would snap him back into line. But Mark had already moved 3 steps ahead. Real Peace Foundation, he had named it. The paperwork was airtight, a registered nonprofit dedicated to community wellness through lakeside therapy and conservation. Every dollar spent on the Fish Fest had been logged as a tax-deductible donation, every fishing pole marked as part of a therapeutic outreach program. The kicker? The foundation had already received a small grant from a regional mental health alliance. When Carol received the ceasefire notice from Mark's attorney, It included a formal statement of exemption and a packet labeled HOA Rights and Responsibilities, a refresher. Beneath the title was a note written in fountain pen, "In case you forgot who owns the water now." The final HOA vote took place in the community clubhouse. It wasn't even close. The ballot box was sealed at dusk. Carol didn't speak. She packed her briefcase and left through the side exit. A for sale sign appeared in her front yard 2 days later, slanted slightly left, violating her own aesthetic alignment rule. Mark watched it all unfold from the place he loved most, the end of his dock. The sun hung low, scattering gold across the rippling water. Behind him, laughter echoed, kids racing along the shoreline, parents lounging in fold-out chairs, the scent of grilled corn and sunscreen in the air. A golden retriever barked as it chased after a frisbee, splashing joy into the shallow edge. He didn't need a title. He didn't need a seat on the new board. All he had ever wanted was right in front of him. A neighbor approached, barefoot, beer in hand. "You really stuck it to them." Mark smiled without looking back, flicked his wrist, and let his line fly into the calm. The bobber landed with a soft plunk, ripples dancing outward like a slow applause. "I just wanted to fish in peace," he said, and finally, he could.